I'm Brad Roberts, Director of the Center for Global Security Research, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's session with Dr. Jonathan Hunt, who will be presenting on the topic of the nuclear club, how America and the world policed the atom from Hiroshima to Vietnam. I'll leave it to Jonathan to make an introduction of his substantive material, so let me just introduce him. He's an historian of international relations and an assistant professor of strategy at the U.S. Air War College. He is also co-editor with Simon Miles of The Reagan Moment, America and the World in the 1980s, and a new book, which he's speaking to today, that came out a year ago from Stanford University Press under the title of The Nuclear Club, How America and the World Policed the Atom from Hiroshima to Vietnam. He has a PhD in history from the University of Texas at Austin. He has taught or held fellowships at CSAC over at Stanford, at the Rand Corporation, at Emory University, and the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard, as well as appointments at the University of Southampton and the University of Oxford, and also the Kennan Institute. You've been a lot of places, Jonathan. And his writings have been published in Foreign Policy, War on the Rocks, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, and of course, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. And I think Katie's just posted in the chat the links to his new book. Jonathan, thanks so much for making the time to join us for this. Thank you for your work on this important topic. Let me remind the group that when Dr. Hunt is finished with his opening remarks, we'll have a Q&A session, and please raise your hands electronically if you'd like to join that conversation, or send in something in the chat function, and I'll do my best to bring the chat point into play. Jonathan, thanks so much. Over to you.
Brad, I very much appreciate your introduction, and I would be remiss not to mention that Brad was, I think, one of my formative influences, especially on a young scholar at Stanford CSAC, sitting in your policy workshops and listening, but not necessarily heeding your advice that sometimes it's necessary to put one's pencil down. And it's an admonition that I have attempted to live by. That being said, the 10 years of research and writing that went into the book that I'm going to be speaking to today perhaps belie the wisdom of those words. So as an advisor of mine once told me, I will seek not to be perfect in what I'm doing, but instead the next project will be perfect, and I will actually put my pencil down. So thank you so much for inviting me to give this talk today. Also, thank you everybody who is joining us from around the country, from around the world. One of the benefits of, I think, all of our experiences these past 3 years, becoming acclimated to these online environments, these webinars, is we have an opportunity to connect with research that we otherwise wouldn't have the opportunity to. So I really appreciate you taking time out from your day to stare at a screen with my face on it, talking to you about the history of nuclear non-proliferation. So if you'll bear with me a moment, I have a series of slides just to orient my talk with you here today. I've tried to limit the chronological scope of my remarks somewhat today. The book itself, as is noted in the subtitle, it reaches back really beyond Hiroshima to the Manhattan Project, through the initial responses to the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in particular, the fact-finding mission sent by the International Committee of the Red Cross, through the Truman and Eisenhower years, and into, I think, really the focus of my remarks today, the Kennedy and Johnson administration. So for our purposes, I'm going to focus on what I see as really the formative, the foundational decade for what many scholars and practitioners now call the global nuclear non-proliferation regime. A decade that was beset by crises, decade during which the Cold War competition between the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, began to fracture and reform as both Moscow and Washington tried to make sense of a world in which power, and in particular nuclear science and technology, was globalizing and increasingly interacting with territorial disputes that had arisen from the aftershocks of decolonization. So, in order to start us off today, I wanted to draw us back to a moment at an institution not unlike the one I teach at. I teach at the U.S. Air War College, Institute of Professional Military Education. My students are 05s and 06s, lieutenant colonels, colonels in the U.S. Air Force, Space Force, Army, Marines, as well as captains in the U.S. Navy. And about, I think, 54 years ago now, the National Security Advisor to the Johnson administration, Walt Rostow, was asked to give the commencement address. Before those assembled, most of whom by that point would have been promoted to 06 to colonel or captain in the Navy, many of whom would also go on to serve in leadership positions in Southeast Asia, Walt Rostow asked them a pregnant question. How long, quote, until Germany, Japan, Italy, India, and others build the atom bomb? In response to growing predictions that a set of new states would enter the nuclear club, the United States and other countries around the world had spent the previous 6 years negotiating the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, a treaty that the U.S. Department of State had characterized as an exercise in U.S. Soviet détente, what Rostow cheekily dubbed a good deed in a naughty world. Rostow asked the assembled officers to think about this treaty from another standpoint, that for him and others in the Johnson administration, the NPT represented instead a combined effort with their supposed rivals in Moscow to halt, quote, the potential diffusion of power at its most important point. And it was for this reason, Rostow continued, that he and the administration he served were prepared to lock the country and its expeditionary military forces, quote, into responsibility in the world, right around the periphery of communist China and the Soviet Union on the toughest of all issues. So for the remainder of my remarks today, I'm going to, first of all, describe the origins of this common effort between the United States and Soviet Union, and in particular, the role that the People's Republic of China under Mao Zedong played in creating what was seen as a need, a desire for some restrictions on the spread of nuclear weapons. From there, I will speak more about the process, the sort of how this U.S. Soviet atomic condominium unfolded across the middle of the 1960s, and then finally speak to this relationship between global nuclear order and strategic deterrence, the ways in which the superpowers, and in particular the United States, buttressed this push for a non-proliferation treaty and built it atop what many today would call a US-led liberal order. And with that, hopefully in less than 35 or 40 minutes, I can then get to some of the major themes and lessons of my book. That being said, I have spent the past 2 years teaching in professional military education. And so one thing the military loves is the bottom line up front, shorthanded as bluff. So a few of the, I would say, central arguments that my book attempts to make. First, that while the nuclear revolution was indeed the most important phenomenon in world politics after the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, just as important was this effort by the superpowers and to a lesser extent other nuclear weapon states to rein in this revolution and its universalization. Second, that the popularity of nuclear inhibitions, and this is a broader category in which I would include test ban agreements, nuclear weapon free zones, first in Antarctica, then in Latin America, and then finally the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, that it was driven by a fear of catalytic and asymmetric postures. This is an area where I, as an historian, am drawing upon kind of new theories of nuclear deterrence, in particular multipolar nuclear deterrence. Caitlin Talmadge and Vipin Narang have really kind of led the way in this, and understanding from the superpower point of view that new nuclear weapon arsenals, new nuclear arsenals, were often seen primarily through their catalytic potential, their potential to draw great powers and the superpowers in particular into these regional disputes. Third, that while nuclear proliferation dynamics in the Middle East and South Asia were the chief concerns at the time, in particular Israel and India, the non-proliferation regime was very much built atop a foundation of alliances, in particular those of the United States and Europe and East Asia, the hub and spoke system, but also the Soviet Warsaw Pact. And lastly, at the highest level, these nuclear accords promise to reinforce Soviet and American strategic deterrence architectures in these two regions. We've just heard it from Walt Rostow, and that in essence, the global non-proliferation regime was a way in which to reinforce and consolidate American and Soviet deterrence, and therefore American and Soviet hegemony. Now, this research, as I mentioned, it's taken about a decade of my life. And as an historian and international historian, I try to spend as much time as I can in archives, not only archives in the United States, but also around the world. And so you'll see various moments in this presentation. I'll be drawing on primary sources from U.S. archives, presidential archives, but also from the French diplomatic archives, from the Soviet contemporary history archives, or sorry, the Russian, one of the bad habits of a Cold War historian, Russian diplomatic archives, as well as those of NATO and a variety of other countries. Now, as I mentioned before, the real impetus, and we could go back even to the first proposal for a non-proliferation treaty by the Irish foreign minister in 1958. Happy to talk about that more in Q&A. The impetus was the eruption of these Cold War crises that often brought the superpower balance of terror into conversation with territorial and proxy disputes. This goes back to 1958, the second Taiwan Straits crisis, as well as the crisis in the Middle East following the British and American interventions in Jordan and Lebanon. But in 1962, these crises, one of which very famous, probably don't need to elaborate too greatly, the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. But what is often left out of some narratives of the Cold War, as well as global nuclear order, was the concurrent crisis, the Sino-Indian border war between the Republic of India under Jawaharlal Nehru and the People's Republic of China under Mao Zedong. What this crisis illustrated to both the Kremlin as well as Washington, D.C., was that the People's Republic of China, first of all, was increasingly adventurous, that it was willing to use the shield of the Soviet nuclear deterrent to pursue its own territorial and desires and its national interests, but also that relations between the two most populous non-white states, China and India, were no longer necessarily capable of operating under this umbrella of peaceful coexistence that had become a real point of emphasis for Nikita Khrushchev, but also within the non-aligned movement, which had made peaceful coexistence a hallmark of its vision of international relations during the Cold War. Kennedy's response to this was very much to see this challenge of a revolutionary China espousing wars of national liberation, and which, according to the best intelligence estimates, was likely to achieve a nuclear arsenal within the next 18 to 24 months. So looking forward to 1963, 1964, and which, because of both the newness of this arsenal, the fact that its rudimentary nature would essentially mean that it was by nature a catalytic or asymmetric, really postured to be used early in a conflict in ways that could very much spiral out of control for the superpowers. And for this reason, even though much of the discourse within the United States remained focused on the U.S. Soviet arms race, for Kennedy and those in his administration, the focus began to shift over the course of, first the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Sino-Indian border war, and into 1963 on how to deal with this new revolutionary nuclear capable People's Republic of China. So I have a quote here from Kennedy, it's reporting from George Bundy, then his national security advisor, that for him, the idea of this nuclear armed China was quote unquote intolerable to the United States and to the West, simply because it would be that destabilizing. Now, from the perspective of the United States, this fit into larger nuclear strategy and planning that at the time of the Eisenhower administration and into the Kennedy administration continued to embrace a kind of massive retaliation. The single integrated operational plan, PSYOP 1962, still more or less called for massive nuclear strikes against both the Soviet Union as well as the People's Republic of China. The Kennedy administration, which had come into office, really criticizing the Eisenhower administration for allowing a missile gap to arise between the United States and the Soviet Union, found that instead it had inherited an arsenal that was qualitatively as well as quantitatively superior to that of the Soviet Union. But at the same time, the Kennedy administration found that its troubles lay more and more in what at the time was called the Third World rather than in Europe. For this reason, the Kennedy administration sought, and this is fairly well-received wisdom, this transition from massive retaliation to flexible response. Now, historians such as Frank Gavin have noted that in fact that this change between massive retaliation and flexible response was more rhetorical than real, than in fact PSYOP 62 did not terrifically differ from PSYOP 61, that in fact Strategic Command remained postured to inflict massive and unacceptable damage to the communist world in the event of a major conflict. And yet in the Kennedy administration's dealings with various allies in the Middle East, in Latin America, and in East Asia, found that notions of flexible response, and in particular, the possibility of introducing tactical nuclear weapons into the equation, was a powerful card to play in their diplomatic dealings. This was true with Shah Pahlavi in Iran, who at the time was quite concerned about Soviet Red Army formations on his border. This was also true on the Korean Peninsula, as well as in Indochina, where I'm sure I don't need to explain to our audience, the Kennedy administration was witnessing increased societal challenges to No Dinh Diem's regime in Hanoi, in Saigon, as well as increased insurgent activity by the Viet Minh. And so the Kennedy administration, in various conversations, including those looking to the defense of India, began speaking more commonly about the utility of tactical nuclear weapons. In one session of the National Security Council in May of 1963, Kennedy himself would note that if we are, quote, overrun in Korea, in Formosa, term in those days for Taiwan, or in Western Europe, we would obviously use nuclear weapons. If we are prepared to defend Korea and Thailand, he went on, why should we not be prepared to commit ourselves to defend India? And one of the more interesting findings over the course of my archival visits was the seriousness with which first the Kennedy and then the Johnson administration, Walt Rostow in particular, would conceptualize various nuclear sharing arrangements with the Republic of India in order to deter the arrival of a nuclear armed People's Republic of China. Now, for the Department of Defense, then under the leadership of Robert McNamara, what these various circumstances suggested was that the era of U.S. Soviet bipolarity was perhaps at the end. And here I'll hark back to Walt Rostow's comments about this diffusion of power, in particular the spread of nuclear science, technology, power reactors to the rest of the world. And so in a report that was presented to McNamara by the DoD, we have this judgment in the summer of 1963 that in fact the world was no longer bilateral. it went on to state that the most significant and potentially most dangerous fact is that it is on the verge of losing this bilateral character. It continued that from this perspective, the acquisition, the arrival of new nuclear arsenals, whether by China, by adversaries like China, by partners like Israel, or by supposedly neutral states such as the United Arab Republic, then the name for Greater Egypt, would decrease the power and influence as well as the security of both the United States and the Soviet Union. It went on to say that the development by Beijing of just 5 small, relatively small for the time, 50 kiloton weapons would decrease US security more than the addition of 5 1 megaton weapons to the current Soviet industry. And for this reason, or at the very least, became a motivation for increasing dealings with Moscow, most specifically the negotiation of the Limited Test Ban Treaty in the summer of 1963. This is a story that's been told previously. Most historians have really emphasized the importance of Germany from the Soviet perspective of keeping Germany out of the nuclear club. But I think what we see from diplomatic documents, from documents at the Kennedy archives, as well as Soviet documents, is just as consequential was this fear and plans about how to deal with China's eventual nuclear breakthrough. And in fact, the Limited Test Ban Treaty can be seen as the first effort to, in essence, cast the People's Republic of China as what we would now call a rogue state. And in fact, there's a very memorable memorandum where the State Department is more or less saying the Limited Test Ban Treaty would create this coalition of both superpowers, the capitalist bloc as well as the communist world, as well as neutral and non-aligned nations, in particular India, who would in essence gang up against the People's Republic of China when it did eventually test a nuclear weapon, as it would on October 16th, 1964. Now, the finalization of the Limited Test Ban Treaty in the summer of 1963 really set the stage for 5 years of negotiations over a non-proliferation agreement. This agreement would be hashed out at the 18-nation Committee of Disarmament, which met in Geneva, featured 5 members of the capitalist bloc, 5 members of the communist world, as well as 8 non-aligned and neutral states from Europe, Latin America, Africa, Asia, the rest of the world. And what's quite striking about these meetings, here I have a picture of the chief American negotiator, William Foster, as well as his Soviet counterpart, Semyon Sasarokhin, is first of all, the relationships that would be forged in Geneva over the course of kind of endless, exhausting plenary sessions, as well as backroom dealings, but as well the enthusiasm with which Soviet negotiators would put forth this notion of a kind of atomic condominium. So in one conversation between Semyon Sasarokhin and Foster, Foster reports that Sasarokhin takes the line that, quote, all other countries, so he includes France, China, India, Egypt, even East Germany, so this is a set of neutral but also allied nations, were, quote, playing the superpowers against each other, trying to obtain advantage from differences and contradictions between them. He went on to say they could do it in present circumstances, but if Moscow and Washington, quote, were to agree with each other, everybody else would have no choice but to fall in line. Now, the Soviet motivations for this initiative, I think, are made clear in a set of remarks made by Leonid Brezhnev 4 years later. So the conversation between Foster and Sasarokhin takes place in the fall of 1964. And Brezhnev, as the superpowers were prepared to present this draft non-proliferation treaty to the United Nations, would state that, first of all, it would, quote, completely address the issue of nuclear weapons in Germany. This, I think, historical consensus, my research has shown that indeed the Soviet Union saw this opportunity to really lock in the non-nuclear status for the Federal Republic of Germany as priority number 1. But relatedly, and I think this is something that we can, or maybe we've forgotten over the past 20 to 30 years, in which, quote unquote, rogue states are, certainly US competitors or adversaries have been the most likely to proliferate nuclear weapons was in the 1960s, most of these countries on the verge of a nuclear capability were US allies. And so here, Brezhnev would name West Germany, but also Japan, Israel, Italy, Canada, South Africa, India, Sweden, Brazil, and various other countries. And looking at this, Sweden was neutral, but nonetheless inclined towards the West. India is really the only member of that group that could be considered truly non-aligned, and in fact would pose a special problem to the two superpowers as they sought to finalize the NPT. He went on to say that the fact that most nuclear capable states, those on the threshold, were in the capitalist world meant that this potential over the next 10 to 15 years, so this would be from more or less the 1970s and early 1980s, would grow faster than the corresponding potential of participants in the Warsaw Pact. Now, on the one hand, this was a keen strategic judgment. On the other hand, this was also in the context of a meeting of Warsaw Pact leaders. And so clearly, Brezhnev also has in mind consolidating Soviet hegemony, and in particular, Soviet control over strategic deterrence within this alliance of the unwilling. Now, the sticking point throughout these negotiations was the effort by the United States to assuage German fears of inferiority. In particular, since the United Kingdom had developed a nuclear arsenal in the 50s and 60s, later on with the help of U.S. Polaris missiles, and France as well had tested its first nuclear weapon in February of 1960. The answer, somewhat convoluted at the time, was to create a mixed man fleet of NATO-owned vessels that would, in essence, provide a kind of strategic deterrence for Western Europe, one in which the Germans would not only have a measure of control, but even could have German sailors stationed on board. Now, needless to say, this very much caused rang alarm bells in the Warsaw Pact, East Germany and Poland in particular, although they saw this in particular as a kind of political challenge over the eventual negotiations to end the Second World War. But even for US allies in NATO, the notion of Germany, only 20 years after the conclusion of the Second World War, the Second World War fought in the wake of German aggression, would acquire some control over nuclear weapons, was really seen as anathema. The Kennedy and then Johnson administrations kind of keep it on life support as long as they can, but ultimately are informed by Brezhnev and by Soviet diplomats that the MLF, this multilateral force, would be incompatible with a non-proliferation agreement. Now, the history of this resolution is fairly well documented. The first component of this was a proposal by Robert McNamara for a committee at the ministerial level that would give Western European as well as Canada, Western European nations as well as Canada, some involvement in discussions relating to NATO's nuclear strategy. As well, the creation of a nuclear planning group within NATO that would institutionalize this more multilateral approach to nuclear strategy as well as nuclear posture. But so too, the Joint Chiefs of Staff decide, more or less over the course of these really difficult negotiations, that the multilateral force was no longer necessary in order to maintain the credibility of US extended deterrence in Western Europe. Now, the multilateral force and its eventual demise has a really interesting side note. Ultimately, this choice between the MLF and the Non-Proliferation Treaty could only be resolved at the presidential level. Lyndon Johnson, rather infamously, very much a creature of domestic politics, very much focused on his great society at home, as well as the prosecution of an escalating war in South Vietnam. Simply, and I've spent more days than I can recount in the Johnson Presidential Library, simply, didn't have a lot of investment in this particular foreign policy issue. And as a result, he often found himself at the mercy of conflicting advice from his political and military advisors. And what ultimately breaks the stalemate is the Vietnam War, and in particular the midterm elections in 1966, where Johnson and his politicos are looking for a sort of a peace initiative that could help balance out this increasing public perception of him and his administration as war fighters. Happy to talk about that more in Q&A, but I think a fairly novel finding of my book. So as the two sides finally come to an agreement over the first two articles of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which would in essence outlaw the transfer of nuclear weapons from nuclear weapon states to non-nuclear weapon states, their acquisition or manufacture by non-nuclear weapon states, but would permit the forward deployment of nuclear powers arsenals. This would be quite important, of course, in the Euro Missile Crises of the late 1970s and 1980s, was also punctuated by more territorial disputes in 1967. So I've left off of this slide, of course, a worsening security situation in South Vietnam as U.S. military forces are surging to 300, 400, eventually 500,000 troops on the ground. But in addition, you have the detonation of a hydrogen bomb by the People's Republic of China, again seen as a very alarming sign in the midst of the Vietnam War, as well as the Six-Day War between Israel, Egypt, Syria, and various other Arab states. Once again, especially given intelligence that Israel and the Dimona reactor was getting closer and closer to a weaponizable nuclear capability, was seen by both superpowers as injecting a degree of insecurity in the Middle East that was, in essence, intolerable. This is a state of affairs that Brezhnev would speak to at a meeting of the Warsaw Pact in March of 1968, noting that specifically with reference to Israel, South Africa, and others, the imperialist states will, and reading from the slide, obtain in this case additional abilities for the conducting of dangerous provocations in different areas of the world. In essence, that the acquisition of nuclear weapons by these, in these two cases, Israel and South Africa, fairly at odds with their neighbors, but also somewhat beneficiaries of support from the United States, would very much be to the detriment of Soviet interests in the wider world. He would go on to state that if India, and speaking to the kind of dyadic, the bilateral relationships that threaten to increase the pace of proliferation, if India were to gain nuclear power, then probably Pakistan would go along with it. Could not be ruled out that such situations can appear in Africa, Latin America, concluding in these conditions, so-called local conflicts with the use of nuclear weapons can easily spread also to the great nuclear powers. And one of the more interesting findings from the Soviet archives is that intelligence reports were very much noting that in the case of the People's Republic of China, in the case of these other likely proliferators, their arsenals would simply be incredibly vulnerable in comparison to those of the United States or the Soviet Union, even the United Kingdom or France. And so the fear there is less the kind of appearance of mutual assured destruction with these new states, but instead that these fledgling arsenals would be much more likely to be used, that they could be locked into a kind of use it or lose it scenario, whether in a conventional conflict with their neighbors or in the event of superpower intervention. So as the two sides have more or less come to the conclusion that a non-proliferation treaty is in their mutual interest, they're nonetheless faced with the question of how exactly to convince the rest of the world that it's also in their interest. After all, the Non-Proliferation Treaty is inherently a discriminatory treaty. It's a treaty that is going to elevate 5 states to this upper echelon of nuclear power. Just happens to be the 5 states that have that are either on the UN Security Council or, in the case of Beijing, have a claim to be on the UN Security Council. And so Soviet officials, as well as their American counterparts, really see a kind of blueprint, a kind of game plan for pushing the Non-Proliferation Treaty over the line that would draw upon the resources embodied by the US-led liberal order. And I've broken these down into three categories. The first being security, the second being voice, both in multilateral institutions like NATO, as well as the United Nations. And then last of all, regulation, or what IR theorists would refer to as global common goods. Just to give put a little bit of meat on the bone, for US allies, nuclear guarantees and voice, the first would be the reaffirmation of the NATO alliance. Quite significantly, the NATO treaty was due to expire in 1969. And so the Germans more or less convinced the United States and the rest of the alliance to renew that treaty in advance in perpetuity in order for them to feel secure enough to join, to voluntarily renounce nuclear weapons. This was also repeated during the Senate ratification debate in the United States. The second leg of this would be the reaffirmation of the US-Japanese Treaty of Mutual Cooperation and an explicit avowal that this would cover nuclear threats to Tokyo. Harlan Cleveland, then the ambassador to NATO, would put a fine point on this, stating that, quote, the dependence of our non-nuclear allies on our nuclear arsenal has just been copper bottomed. And their sense of involvement in our negotiations about nuclear missiles, looking forward to the strategic arms limitation talks under Richard Nixon, can only become more acute. So you can very much see this kind of two-face sort of solution to the problem of non-proliferation. On the one hand, extended nuclear deterrence. On the other hand, increased levels of voice within US bilateral and multilateral security alliances. Now, there was also a bit of a stick that went along with this, related to the application of IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency safeguards. And this very much had to do with the reconciliation of that safeguard regime with that of the European community, Euratom. And it's quite clear from the diplomatic, the telegraphic back and forth conversation by John J. McCloy, very much seen as a friend to the West German regime in Bonn, stating, I think, quite cheekily, that there is no question in my mind that Euratom member states party to the NPT will put good faith efforts to negotiate a satisfactory agreement to have IAEA safeguards integrated into their system. He then goes on to say, I think you can have equal confidence that the United States will meet its commitments to supply nuclear fuel. So it's quite important for Euratom because at the time they remained reliant upon enriched uranium. This is before, of course, Urenco and the creation of, as these kind of more advanced centrifuges are coming online through research efforts by Euratom members. At the time, this was very much a stick, some leverage that Washington could use to bring Euratom on board this global rather than regional safeguards regime. Now, Jean Gersoy and others have written about how fears of abandonment very much prompted West Germany to join the Non-Proliferation Treaty. I would put this, and my book puts this more in terms of alliance self-containment. If you read the views and conversations with West European NATO members, Denmark, the Netherlands, even Italy, and others, they very much saw and looked to the United States and the larger alliance to contain German nuclear ambitions through this integrated multilateral framework. In essence, Germany could either have nuclear weapons or it could have NATO. It could not have both. And so this, I think, is very much helps to explain why Germany joins the NPT and remains non-nuclear to this day. There's a similar dynamic in what we would now call the Indo-Pacific. And so some very telling conversations with members of the Australian Foreign Ministry in which they express their concerns about being, quote, behind India and Japan if either were to suddenly withdraw from the NPT. So even though Indo-Pacific lacked this multilateral arrangement, relying upon the US hub and spoke system, this did provide nonetheless a kind of structural environment in which middle powers like Australia would be willing to join. And in addition, Australia, with fairly large uranium mining concerns, was also assured that these safeguards would only apply to enriched uranium rather than uranium ore that they were seeking to export. I'll kind of speak just briefly about Soviet partners and neutrals. I'm happy to talk about this more in Q&A, but I'm mindful that we're getting a little low on time. In the Middle East, of course, the Israel Egypt dyadic was seen as absolutely critical to the success of the NPT in South Asia, the relationship between India and Pakistan as well. And the Soviets would, in fact, work hard on Egypt in particular in order to bring it on board the NPT negotiations, first in Geneva at the 18-Nation Committee on Disarmament, then in New York at the United Nations General Assembly. And in fact, we see French diplomats noting that Egypt had more or less gone along due to strong pressure from Moscow. For Cuba, it's a slightly different story because of the creation concurrently of a nuclear weapon-free zone in Latin America. And there, the Soviets would be somewhat more amenable to Cuban resistance, in particular because of their memories of abandonment during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But as I mentioned earlier, perhaps the largest sticking point for the finalization of the NPT was India. India was somewhat uniquely situated. It had a border dispute with a nuclear armed power, People's Republic of China, and nonetheless continued to profess the Articles of Non-Alignment and, at least publicly, disavowing a desire to attain nuclear weapons. Soviet relations with India were also much closer than those of the United States. Kosygin goes some extent in order to encourage, but never pressure, the Indian government of Indira Gandhi to accept and eventually sign and ratify the Non-Proliferation Treaty. There's some language added in a joint statement in January of 1968, but nonetheless, by that April, the two countries have signed a nuclear agreement with no conditionality. Nuclear agreement for Soviet assistance with India's peaceful nuclear programs that nonetheless would not require the most prominent non-aligned state to join the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And so what comes out of India's search for security in the midst of these non-proliferation negotiations is UNSC Resolution 255. And this will be the subject upon which I end my talk. From the very beginning, the Non-Proliferation Treaty and its how desirable it was seen by non-nuclear weapon states was tied up with questions of security assurances, both positive to support these countries in the case of attack by nuclear weapons or nuclear blackmail, as well as negative promises by nuclear weapon states not to use their nuclear weapons against future states party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. There were various proposals throughout the negotiations to bring greater substance to the nuclear assurances that neutral and non-aligned states might enjoy under the non-proliferation regime, but they ran up again and again against Soviet American resistance to, in essence, eschew the use of nuclear weapons against certain states. So we have internal deliberations within the United States about a non-use agreement, and we see from the Joint Chiefs of Staff really a reluctance to go down this road, specifically because they wanted to maintain the advantages that tactical nuclear weapons could provide in South Vietnam as well as South Korea. Likewise, the Soviets were unwilling to go to support a non-use agreement that would cover states with U.S. nuclear weapons stationed upon them. And so when Romania is making difficulties towards the end of the treaty negotiations, Brezhnev would push back and more or less state that this would be a gift to West Germany if there were to be non-use guarantees that did not cordon off those states that took advantage of NATO's nuclear stockpile. So this proves to be a real sticking point, helping us to understand why the NPT originally only was accompanied by very loose security assurances through the UN Security Council. In essence, assurances that nuclear-armed members, permanent members of the Security Council would respond expeditiously in the event that states parties were threatened by nuclear weapons or the use of nuclear weapons. Now, UNSC Resolution 255, my book argues, is a kind of important yet forgotten chapter of the negotiation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and in particular, the way in which it introduces a new expectation, if not norm, of military intervention in the event that nuclear threats were to be leveled by non-nuclear weapon states. And I mean, I thought one of the most interesting documents I came across was in the French Foreign Ministry archives, in which lawyers, looking at the security resolution, comparing it to the UN Charter, in essence argued that it would introduce new and potentially perverse elements into the United Nations system. The first of which would be this discriminatory nature, this inherently discriminatory nature of the treaty. Secondly, that it would hierarchize, create a hierarchy between conventional and nuclear threats of aggression. Third, that it would distinguish among permanent members those which possess nuclear arms and invest in the present situation a, quote, anti-Chinese character that Beijing at the time was certainly not failing to note. They would issue broadside after broadside against what they saw as the Soviet American atomic condominium. And then lastly, that this resolution would depart from the established jurisdiction of the Security Council, whose decisions heretofore had always applied to specific problems. And for this reason, the French would choose, somewhat infamously, neither to sign nor ratify the treaty until the 1990s, in their public pronouncement stating that, quote, "We refuse to participate in an enterprise which, while not representing a real measure of disarmament, tends to establish for the benefit of the two greatest powers a system which would consolidate nuclear monopolies and legalize discrimination between states." And here I see some of this initial recognition that nuclear nonproliferation as an institution, as a regime in the world system, would give rise to a tendency, even a willingness to intervene militarily in the event a nuclear threat was identified and the point at which that nuclear threat would materialize. Would it be the acquisition of an arsenal, a threat against a member of the NPT, or would it be simply the acquisition of centrifuges that could produce enriched uranium? Now, ultimately, the UN does affirm the Non-Proliferation Treaty, first in the political committee, then in the General Assembly, fairly strong vote of 95-4 and 4 against. 3 days later, UN SE Resolution 255 would pass the Security Council on June 18th of 1968. And from this longer history of the origins of nuclear nonproliferation, I've tried to draw out a few themes and lessons. The first relates to how the nonproliferation regime was created. First of all, bringing the US-led liberal world order back into the conversation. Debates about the Non-Proliferation Treaty tend to focus on whether it's about non-proliferation first or a kind of grand bargain between non-proliferation, peaceful uses, and good faith efforts at arms control and disarmament. I think this book very much emphasizes these voice opportunities. It emphasizes security assurances and extended nuclear deterrence in particular, probably the paradox really at the heart of the non-proliferation enterprise from the beginning. And then lastly, the economic and technological preeminence of the United States at the time. In addition, we see the Soviet Union as a kind of deputy to the United States throughout these proceedings, really driven by their desire to refocus on Europe following various reversals in the quote unquote third world. And then lastly, this entanglement between nuclear order making and strategic deterrence. Also, just a few comments, and I think this will be good prompts for conversation in the Q&A, that we see how regional conventional conflicts also were shaped in turn this search for global nuclear order. The Vietnam, both causing the first breakthrough with Johnson's decision, but also limiting the final scope of the treaty for fear that the United States would give up recourse to tactical nuclear weapons through some kind of negative assurance. Second, that this reliance on existing alliance arrangements and security assurances reinforce stability in Asia and Europe without addressing the roots of instability in the Middle East or Southeast Asia. And then lastly, the non-proliferation diplomacy, and this is perhaps where I try to speak to a larger audience of practitioners and policymakers, should not be pursued in conflict with, but instead as a complement to strategic nuclear deterrence efforts. So with that, I'll end my talk. Encourage you to buy the book, which makes these arguments far better than I can make in a 45-minute presentation, and welcome your questions for the rest of our session. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was very